The morning of the 8th of June, 1783, in the south of Iceland. A small wooden church and a low turf-walled manse on a gravel plain under a long, dark ridge of hills. The light is the long, thin northern light of an Icelandic June. It's 4 in the morning, and it's already been light for an hour. The village is called Kirk Ybæjarklaustur, 150 souls. A parish church, a manse, a few dozen turf-walled houses, a stream, and a long gravel plain that runs south to the sea, 20 miles off. Behind the village, north, the ground rises into the Seatha uplands, a long ridge of dark hills, dotted with small lakes, threaded by the river Skaftá. There is a man awake in the manse, at his desk by the window. He's 45 years old. He's the Reverend Jón Steingrímsson, the parish priest of Kirk Ybæjarklaustur for the last 5 years. He has been writing in his diary, by candlelight, for an hour or so. He puts the pen down. He listens. The dogs are restless. They have been restless for 3 weeks. The country priest of a small Icelandic parish in 1783 is a farmer first and a clergyman second. Steingrímsson keeps cattle. He cuts his own peat. He fishes the stream. He preaches on Sundays. He's been a widower for 10 years. His 3 daughters are grown and living in the next parish. He shares the manse with a housekeeper, 2 dogs, and a small flock of sheep that sleep in the byre on the other side of the wall. For 3 weeks now, the ground under the manse has been moving. Not in big shakes, small ones. The kind that makes the cups on the dresser chime against each other for half a second. The kind that wakes the dogs. He has noted each one in the diary, the dates, the times, the duration. He's a methodical man. He puts the pen down. He stands. He goes to the window. He looks out, north, at the dark hills of the Seatha uplands. They are exactly as they have been for every morning of the 5 years he's lived in the manse. He sits back down. He picks the pen up. He writes the date, June 8th, 1783, at the top of the next page. The kettle on the peat stove is starting to make its small first sound. Chapter 1. The Fissure. The morning passes quietly enough. The kettle boils. The Reverend eats breakfast, flatbread, smoked mutton, milk. The housekeeper comes through with the post bag from the previous evening, which she takes down to the stream to soak before she launders it. He walks down to the byre. He counts the sheep. He counts the cattle. The cattle are nervous. He puts a hand on the flank of the nearest cow and feels her trembling, very slightly, in time with something he can't quite hear. He goes back to the manse. He writes a sentence in the diary. He puts the pen down. The sentence reads, and we have his diary in front of us. The cattle were trembling in the byre this morning. in the hands, in the flanks, as if from cold. But the weather was warm, and there was no wind. At 11 in the morning, the dogs start barking. He goes outside. He looks north, at the hills. There is a column of grey-white smoke rising from somewhere behind the ridge, somewhere up on the highland, behind the sea. It is small at first. He thinks for a moment that someone has lit a peat fire up there, but it is too high. He watches for 10 minutes. The column thickens. It rises and rises. By noon, it has reached the level of the cloud base, which on that day is about 2 miles up, and it is still rising. He goes back to the manse. He writes another sentence in the diary. He puts the pen down. He stands at the window. He watches. By the time the sun reaches the top of the sky, and in Iceland in June, the sun stays near the top of the sky for many hours. The column of smoke is a black wall across the northern horizon. It is no longer a column. It is a curtain. There is no sound. Not yet. He goes down to the church and rings the bell. The villagers come out. They stand on the gravel in front of the church and look north. Nobody speaks for a long time. The grey-white curtain on the northern horizon thickens and rises and stays. At 2 in the afternoon, the sound arrives. It is not an explosion. It is a low, continuous roar, like a distant river in flood, except that the nearest river is the Scaff Toe at the bottom of the meadow. And the Scaff Toe this morning is silent. The roar comes from the highland, from the place where the curtain of smoke meets the ground. What is happening up on the highland on the morning of the 8th of June 1783 is that a crack has opened in the surface of the earth. The crack is 27 kilometres long. It runs roughly southwest to northeast, along the line where 2 tectonic plates, the North American plate on one side and the Eurasian plate on the other side, are slowly pulling apart. Out of the crack, basalt is coming up. Molten rock from 25 kilometres beneath the surface, at a rate of about 5,000 cubic meters a second. Along the line of the crack, the basalt is fountaining into the air. There are 130 separate craters along the 27 kilometres. The fountains stand 1.5 kilometres above the ground. Geographers, looking at the line of craters 100 years later, will name the fissure Laki, the craters of Laki, after a small flat-topped mountain at the centre of the line. Reverend Steingrímsson, on the 8th of June 1783, doesn't know any of this. He's standing on the gravel in front of his church with the villagers, listening to the roar. By evening, the column of smoke and ash reaches its full height, about 10 miles. The top of the column is in the stratosphere, where the winds blow east and southeast across the Atlantic. The grey-white curtain begins to tilt that way too. Reverend Steingrímsson goes back to the manse. He writes one more sentence in the diary. He puts the pen down. He blows out the candle. He goes to bed. Chapter 2. The Flow. On the second day, the lava begins to move. It comes down out of the highland by the bed of the Skaftoe. The river itself has evaporated. The heat of the lava boils the water to steam 2 kilometres before the flow reaches it. By the morning of the 9th of June, the Skaftoe is a gorge of steam and white air. By the 10th, the lava is in the bed itself, 8 kilometres up the valley from the village. By the 12th, 6 kilometres. The villagers can see it from the church now. A red-orange line, very low, moving very slowly down the dry valley. It is moving at about 2 kilometres a day. 2 kilometres a day is fast enough to be alarming and slow enough to plan around. The villagers do both. Some of them pack what they can on a horse and walk south to the coast. Some of them go east towards the next parish. Most of them stay. Reverend Steingrímsson stays. He says, and we have this in the diary, that he will not leave the church. The lava continues to move. By the 15th of June, it is 4 kilometres from the village. By the 18th, 3. By the 20th, 2.5. It is now visible from the manse window without leaning. A low orange seam at the top of the Skaftoe gorge, moving slowly southward across the dark hill. Through it all, the column of smoke from the highland keeps rising. The grey-white curtain across the north has thickened to a roof. Ash is falling now. Fine, pale grey ash, like a slow snow that doesn't melt. The grass in the village meadow is dusted with it by the second week. There is something else happening too, that the villagers can smell but can't yet name. We will come back to that. Chapter 3. What the villagers can smell. It comes over the village on the 3rd week of the eruption, not all at once, slowly, the way a season turns. First, the air tastes faintly of vinegar at the back of the throat. Then, the breath catches on it. Then the eyes start to sting. What the villagers don't know, what nobody on the island knows, is that the column of smoke rising out of the highland has been pouring something else into the air all along. 120 million tons of it over the 8 months of the eruption. Sulfur dioxide. And mixed with the steam of the lava, hydrofluoric acid. Both invisible. Both heavier than air. Both settling in the still nights into the meadows of the southern districts. The grass yellows first. Then it browns. Then it goes brittle and silver under the falling ash. The cattle stop eating. They stand in the byre, listless. The Reverend writes the date in the diary, the 28th of June, 1783, and the line beneath it. The cattle have lost their appetite. The grass is no longer to their liking. Then the sheep start to limp. They go down on their front knees in the meadow. Their teeth break against the grass. What's happening is a thing modern veterinary science has a name for: fluorosis. The fluoride in the ash binds to the calcium in the bones, and the bones go soft. The teeth wear down to stumps. The young animals get it first. The old ones go down a few weeks later. Across Iceland that summer, 4 out of every 5 sheep die, 3 out of every 4 horses, half the cattle. The Reverend buries lambs in the meadow behind the manse, where the grass is too poisoned to be worth saving. The dogs are still alive. So is the housekeeper. So is the Reverend. They eat what they have stored. Salt fish, smoked mutton, dried angelica root from the previous summer. The kettle still boils on the peat stove. Outside, the curtain of ash keeps falling. Chapter 4. What lands in England? The 8-mile high column rising out of the highland behind the village doesn't stay over Iceland. Above the cloud base, the winds are moving south and east, across the North Atlantic, towards Europe. By the middle of July, the sulfate aerosol from the upper troposphere has drifted across the sea and reached the British Isles. It hangs there, 10 miles up. It doesn't rain out. It just sits, thinning the sunlight by a few % and turning the sky a dry blue-grey. In Hampshire, in a village called Selborne, a country clergyman in his early 60s, a naturalist, a parish priest, a careful keeper of weather records, notices something he hasn't seen before. His name is Gilbert White. He has lived in the same village for 60 years. He keeps a journal of the weather and the wildflowers and the swallows and the soil. He writes a letter that summer to a friend, a man called Daines Barrington, who lives in London. The letter, and we have it, is dated August. It opens with a single observation. The summer of the year 1783 was an amazing and portentous one. And then he describes the haze. A peculiar blue-coloured fog in the upper air, unseasonable heat at ground level, the sun appearing pale and red, especially at noon, a smell that he calls horrid but can't pin down, and oddly, flies in numbers nobody can remember. He doesn't know what's causing any of it. Nobody in England does. The newspapers blame swamp gases, or the comet of 1779, or the wrath of God. Across the Channel, in a small village called Passy, just west of Paris, an old American doctor sits in his garden and watches the same haze. He's 77. He's been in Paris for nearly a decade, on the slow business of getting France to recognize the American Republic. He's a printer by trade and a scientist by inclination. His name, of course, is Benjamin Franklin. Franklin watches the haze for the rest of the summer. He records the unusual dryness, the pale sun, the unseasonable heat through August, and the strange chill in the wind at the end of it. He spends the autumn thinking about it. Sometime in the winter, he sits down and writes a short paper. He calls it Meteorological Imaginations and Conjectures. He reads it to the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society on the 22nd of December, 1784. It runs to fewer than 1,000 words. In the paper, Franklin proposes, very tentatively, very politely, that the haze of the previous summer might have been caused by a distant volcanic eruption. He names the candidate, an eruption in Iceland that he had heard about at second hand from a Dutch merchant in Paris. It's the first time, anywhere in writing, that anyone has suggested a volcano on one side of the world could change the climate on the other side. Modern climatology dates itself very quietly from that paper. And the man who first wrote it down, the man who reasoned it out from a haze in his garden, is sitting 1,800 miles south of the country priest at the manse, watching the same fog. Chapter 5. The Cold Winter. The summer of 1783 was the hottest summer England could remember. The winter that follows, it is the coldest. The first frost arrives in the third week of October, a month earlier than the parish records have ever marked one. By November, snow lies on the ground from Yorkshire to Cornwall. In London, the Thames freezes hard enough to hold a frost fair. The river ices over from Westminster to Limehouse, 3 feet thick in places. The watermen who normally row passengers across set-up stalls on the ice and sell roast goose and gin. Across the Atlantic, in Louisiana, the Mississippi River freezes at New Orleans. The river is half a mile wide there, and warm-fed from the Gulf. It has not frozen in the 80 years that records have been kept. It will not freeze again in the 240 years that follow. In France, the wheat harvest of 1783 is poor. The harvest of 1784 is worse. The price of bread in Paris rises by 60% across those 2 years. Some historians have drawn a line from the failed harvests of the mid-1780s to the bread riots of the late 1780s to the French Revolution. The line is contested. It's also not quite the story being told here. What's certain is the cold. The Thames freezes. The Mississippi freezes. The wheat fails. And across England that winter, the bills of mortality run higher than usual. 2 modern researchers, Claire Witham and Clive Oppenheimer, working at the University of Cambridge, have done the careful, decades later arithmetic. By their count, the haze of 1783 killed about 23,000 people in England alone, most of them old, most of them in the smoggy parishes of the industrial north, most of them by lung disease. Across the rest of Europe, France, the Low Countries, Italy, Scandinavia, the toll is harder to pin down. The estimates run somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 more. None of these numbers reach the manse at Kirk U by our Closter, where the Reverend is still burying lambs. He'll learn about them, eventually, about Gilbert White, about Benjamin Franklin, about the frost fair on the Thames, but not for years. For now, he's still inside his own winter, and his is worse than anyone else's. Chapter 6. The missed hardships. By October of 1783, the eruption has been going for 4 months, and the haze has been settling on Iceland for 3. The grass is poisoned. The hay barns hold only what survived the contamination, perhaps a third of a normal year. The cattle are dead. The sheep are dead. The fish in the rivers, where the runoff has reached, are dead. And the country is going into a winter that everyone can already feel will be a hard one. The Icelandic winter of 1783 to 84, and what comes after it, earns a name. The country calls it Mo Thu Har Thin Din, the missed hardships. It will kill when the count is done. Somewhere around 9,000 Icelanders, a fifth of the country, most of them children, most of them in the southern districts, under the worst of the haze. At the manse, the Reverend marks every death in the parish register. He writes the name, he writes the date, he writes the cause, when he can guess at it. Between November and March, he buries 30 of his 150 parishioners. Most of them are old. Some are children. A few are people he had married in the same church the previous summer. The housekeeper at the manse falls ill in January. She lives. The Reverend himself falls ill in February. He lives. The dogs are quiet through the whole winter, sleeping by the peat stove, eating dried fish from the storeroom. In Reykjavik, where the haze has been thinner, the chief magistrate writes to the Danish king, who governs Iceland from 1,000 miles away in Copenhagen. He asks, very politely, for relief. The king's ministers consider the request. They consider the cost. They consider the difficulty of sending grain ships to an island 500 miles into the North Atlantic in midwinter. The decision takes them most of a year. By the time the first relief ship arrives at Reykjavik harbour, in the autumn of 1784, the worst of the famine is already over. The eruption has stopped. The grass is beginning to come back, slowly, in the meadows that the river kept clean. Steingrímsson is still at the manse. He's 47 now. He's still writing in the diary, every day. The candle still goes out at midnight. The kettle still boils on the peat stove. Chapter 7. The Fire Mass. We have to go back a few weeks now, to the worst of the summer, to the 20th of July, 1783. The eruption has been going for 6 weeks. The lava in the Skaftá Gorge has been advancing at about 2 kilometres a day for most of June and the start of July. By the 20th, the orange line on the dark hill above the village is much closer than it was when the parishioners first saw it from the church. 8 kilometres from the manse, then, by morning, 7, then 6. The 20th of July is a Sunday. On a normal Sunday, the Reverend would open the church at 9, ring the bell, hold the service, close the church by 10:30, and walk back across the meadow to the manse for breakfast. On this Sunday, he opens the church at 9, rings the bell, and holds the service. Then he doesn't close the church. He keeps preaching. He preaches, according to his own later account, for somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. The villagers, about 90 of them by his count, the survivors of the first weeks of the famine, sit on the wooden benches and listen. The summer heat builds inside the church. The candles lit at the start of the service are now down to stubs. Outside, the lava reaches the cliff above the village. It does what hot rock does at the top of a cliff. It pools. It thickens. It cools at the leading edge into a dark ridge that holds back the rest of the flow behind it. And then, at some point during the long sermon, the cooled ridge gives way at one side. The lava behind it doesn't go forward over the cliff towards the village. It goes sideways into the dry bed of the Scaff Toe River. The dry riverbed becomes the lava's new channel. The flow turns east, away from the village, and runs harmlessly into a flooded plain a few kilometres downstream where there are no farms. Inside the church, nobody can see this. The Reverend keeps preaching. The villagers keep listening. The candles keep burning down. When the service ends, somewhere around noon, the parishioners file out into the bright Sunday daylight and look north, the way they always do. And the orange line above the village is gone. The smoke has thinned. The roar of the eruption is quieter. Nobody speaks for a long time. Then somebody, the Reverend doesn't record who, turns to him and says that his sermon did it. The Reverend, in the diary, writes that this is nonsense. He writes that any reasonable man can see that the riverbed redirected the flow naturally. He writes that the sermon, however long, has no power over 1 million tons of moving rock. He writes that he is grateful, anyway, that the village has been spared. The parish never quite believes him. They begin to call the sermon Eld Mechsan, the fire mass. It enters the local language. It survives in the diaries and the local histories, and 250 years later, on a small bronze plaque outside the rebuilt church in the village. And on whichever side of the question you sit, geology or grace, riverbed or sermon, the village stayed. Chapter 8. The Book. The eruption stops on the 7th of February, 1784. It has been going for 8 months and 3 days. It has put out 14 cubic kilometres of basalt, 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide, and a lava field, 600 square kilometres wide. Nobody, on the morning it stops, sets out a marker. The ground simply stops shaking. The roar fades. The column of ash above the highland thins over the course of a few days into a high, pale haze. By the end of February, the sky over the village is blue again. The grass takes longer. In the first summer, 1784, almost nothing grows in the southern districts. In the second, a few patches of green show themselves at the edges of the lava field. By the 5th summer, sheep can graze again on the high pasture, away from the worst of the ash. By the 10th, the village meadow is full grass again, deep enough to lie down in. Through all of it, the Reverend writes. He writes at the desk by the window. He writes by candlelight in the winter, and by long Icelandic daylight in the summer. He writes for an hour before dawn, and for an hour after the housekeeper has gone to bed. He writes for 18 years. What he writes is the most complete eyewitness account of any volcanic eruption recorded before the 20th century. He calls the manuscript, in the Icelandic of the period, Full komið skrif si thu eld, a complete writing of the cedar fire. He finishes it in 1788, 4 years after the eruption ends. He revises it through the 1790s. He dies in 1801 at the age of 63. The manuscript sits in a wooden chest in the manse for another 106 years. The parish keeps it carefully. In 1907, an Icelandic editor finally publishes it in Reykjavik, a small edition. Most copies go to libraries and to other clergy. A few go to volcanologists in Copenhagen and London, who read it carefully and write back to Iceland with questions. And in the 21st century, when modern volcanologists want to model what a future Icelandic fissure eruption would do to Europe, the first text they read is still the Reverend's. Chapter 9. What outlasts him? 3 things outlast Reverend Jón Steingrímsson. They are all small, in their separate ways. The first is the manuscript. It sits, now, in 2 places at once. The original is in the National Library of Iceland, in Reykjavik, in a temperature-controlled vault under glass. The English translation, finished by an Icelandic translator called Kneva Kunz in 1998, is in print and on the shelves of every university volcanology department on Earth. The second is the paper Benjamin Franklin read to the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society on the 22nd of December, 1784. Fewer than 1,000 words. Tentative, polite. The first time anyone had written down the idea that a volcano on one side of the world could change the climate on the other. Every modern climate model that asks what would happen to global temperatures if a major volcano erupted today, and that's hundreds of such models now, running at universities and weather agencies across the world. Every one of them traces back, in its first citations, to that 1,000 words. The third is the church. The wooden building Steingrímsson preached, the fire mass, burnt down in 1839, 55 years after the eruption. The parish rebuilt on the same foundation. The new church is the one that stands at Kirk Uby ar Kloster today, on the same gravel plain, under the same dark hills. It still holds Sunday morning service. The Lutheran congregation that meets there now is small, about 20 people in winter, 50 in summer. They walk in from the surrounding farms. They sit on wooden benches. They listen to the parish priest, who is not the Reverend Steingrímsson, but who reads, on certain Sundays, from his diary. Outside the church, the lava field is still there, It's called ELD Hroin now. The fire field. 650 square kilometres of black rock stretching south of the village to the coast. After a wet summer, a thin moss grows over the basalt. Sheep graze on it. The black turns slowly, very slowly, into pale grey-green. And inside the manse, which still stands, behind the rebuilt church, much as it stood in 1783, the Reverend is at his desk by the window. He's 63 now. The eruption is 18 years in the past. The lava has cooled. The grass has come back. The lambs in the meadow are the great-great-grandchildren of the lambs he buried. The candle is lit. The pen is on the page. He's finishing the last chapter of the manuscript. The kettle on the peat stove is starting to make its small first sound. Outside, beyond the small window, the wide flat plain of the southern districts runs south to the sea, 20 miles off. The wide flat sky is the long thin sky of a high northern summer. The dogs are asleep at the door, as they have always been. The Reverend Jón Steingrímsson puts the pen down. He picks it up. He writes the next line. This has been History to Sleep To.